Roddy Doyle, thank you so much for coming into Waterstones to have a chat with me about Smile.
It's a pleasure, I hope.
It is a novel that almost sort of stands apart from your other work. You've written a series of novels which deal with the same sort of family and groups and novels that are themed together, but Smile is slightly different, and it does take on a topic which of course is something that has been sort of bubbling under not just Irish society, but sort of the Catholic Church around the world, this idea of institutionalized abuse. What was it that made you want to tackle that head on now?
It wasn't on my list, if you know what I mean. It's my 11th novel, and I do recall when I was sitting down to start writing it, probably about 4 years ago, I was as determined as one can be when you don't know what you're doing, but determined to write something that stretched me, you know. I always tried to make sure, even though I go back to old characters, I add years to their age, I make them different, I make the circumstances, the time different, so it's not just, if you like, falling into a happy routine. But this time round, I don't know exactly why I decided to start writing about a fictionalized version of an event that happened to me when I was 13, but I did. When I was 13, in a class full of boys in a Christian Brother school in Dublin, a Christian brother said to me, "Roddy Doyle, I can never resist your smile." My voice hadn't broken, the hormones were all over the place, and the good news was he didn't say it to me while we were alone, but the bad news was he said it to me while 34 boys were listening.
Yeah.
And it's the only time I ever experienced total silence, ever, for a few seconds, as it registered and the consequences arise. Now, that brother never laid a hand on me, he never told me to stay back after class, he never tried to isolate me. So there might have been an innocence to what he said, but it was so inappropriate. I didn't know the word inappropriate back then, and it wasn't as used as quickly and as readily as it is now, but it was so awful. And the word gay, as we understand it now, wasn't in the air, if you like, in 1971. So I was the queer, the homo. When that particular brother was in the class, I'd get a dig in the back, smile at him, tell him we don't want homework, you know. And that went on for a couple of years, really. Good-naturedly, if you like, within the Queensberry rules of what we call slagging, you know, mocking. But very unwelcome, really, really unwelcome. And that memory has remained consistent through the years. It hasn't haunted me, but it's been there and consistent. And I've told many, many people about it. And I've never varied it, I've never changed it. And there's always, as you know, being Irish and also being a novelist, there is almost a natural urge to change it, you know, to add to it or whatever. But if I'm being honest with myself, and you actually, I think I am, I've always told the same story because it's been consistent. Other things that have been much more profound in my life, or decisions I've made, or things I've said, I forget about them, even though they seem life-altering at the time, but I forget about them. This one has remained the same. So I was ready to write a new novel, but I didn't know what I was going to write. And it worried me a bit. So I started writing about this episode. The autobiographical thing dropped immediately. You know, I did use the type of school, the building. I did use the eccentricities of some of the other teachers and other events that occurred. But I continued to write about the school years in the knowledge that I wasn't going to write a book about a boy in secondary school. It wasn't going to be Paddy Clark, the teenage years. And I realized quite quickly I did want to write about abuse, institutional abuse within the context of the school. But if you were in Ireland, a bit like some years ago, there was a spell after the Jimmy Savile scandal broke. If you were half listening to the radio and you heard the words BBC, you thought, oh no, not again, another one. You know, it became almost expected for a while. And it's the same in Ireland when you hear the word priest, Christian brother, Sisters of Charity, nuns. These words, it was almost like word association. You'd almost expect something horrible to be revealed, to the extent that you ended up sighing, perhaps, you know. So what I wanted to do was tell a story that, in its structure perhaps, or the way I told it, could shock, could do in a way at the risk of sounding a bit arrogant, could do justice to the story. And that's where the big challenge for me was, because I suppose, if we can see our imaginations as a series of doors, I'd pushed open quite a few in the last 30 years, but I was pushing open a door I hadn't pushed open before, and going in a bit and seeing if I could stay there.
And because you were feeling your way into that story, did that make it, I mean, did you find it difficult to, I mean, as you said, you fictionalized it immediately.
It's always difficult to agree. And I've told stories that are linear, if you like. The Commitments, the first book, bunch of young lads form a band, and I knew the band would break up. So that was my story. The challenge, among others, was getting to the end. Why did they break up? What happened along the way? What was the clash of personalities? And a bigger one for me was, how was I going to write dialogue? How was I going to capture the Dublin accent? That's where I made up most of the rules that I've kept to in those 30 years. The Snapper, the second one, the young woman announces she's pregnant, and I knew she'd have the baby, and I knew the baby would be fine. So the problem then was how to get there. But at least I had the comfort of the light at the end of a very long tunnel, you know, or in the case of the Commitments, not a particularly long one, but so I could see the light. Others, I hadn't a clue.
Right.
And this one, even though I was trying to write something new and fresh, I was being reminded of other books I'd written, like Paddy Clark and The Woman Who Walked Into Doors. Structurally, those books aren't linear. And I knew when I got to the end of the first draft of this particular book that I would be doing the same thing. I'd be printing it out, piling up pages on the floor, and deciding, this is chapter 1, this is chapter 3, this is chapter 2, this is chapter 7. I haven't written chapter 6 yet. There's a hole here that needs filling. And eventually coming up with the structure that would allow the ending of the book to exist, and with a bit of luck, and, you know, I would get away with it, you know.
Well, it does have an ending which, I guess, for want of a better word, is a twist, and we probably can't even talk about it for fear of sort of spoiling it. But
so great in that regard, because the interviews have been so short. I can't actually talk about the book. It's brilliant. It's really great. I escaped much sooner.
But you've mentioned dialogue there, and I did want to ask you about that, because your work is absolutely characterised by very heavy use of dialogue and absolutely capturing that Dublin idiomatic language. Some writers really struggle to get dialogue, to get it right, but you don't seem to struggle. In fact, you do it so well that you've written lots of, in fact, your sort of 2 Pints books are entirely dialogue. You know, it's just, why are you so good at it? Is it a question of just having a good ear and listening to how people talk? Is it a Dublin thing?
It is a Dublin thing. It's an Irish thing, really.
Yeah.
You know, people who come to visit me, or people I meet who've come to Dublin, they get off the plane into a taxi, and the taxi driver starts chatting to them immediately. Whereas I've been in taxis here where there isn't a word exchanged.
You may be glad of that, but
yeah, well, there you go. That's I'm not necessarily saying a talking taxi driver is a good idea, but there are plenty of them in Dublin. People talk on the bus, people talk on the train, people talk in queues, people talk quite loudly. The pub culture is still there and intact. A lot of people chatting all the time, you know. And I was a teacher for 14 years in the company of every day of several hundred people, all of whom, or not all, but most of whom were happy to just talk their tongues into non-existence, you know. So I grew up listening to people, and a bit like my mother, I think. My father was a great mimic, and he loved language, but my mother used to savour words in many, many ways, and still does. And takes great joy in the use and sometimes the misuse of a word, and hearing it and tells me about it. And I remember from an early age being interested in that, not in an academic way, if you like, but just in almost like a hobby. I didn't take notes or anything like that, but I always enjoyed listening to people and their quirks and hesitations and the way that they, and as my children then began to grow up, the way that they would command the language with the smaller vocabulary. And one of my kids, for example, when he was a little lad, started every sentence with the word "and." And of course, in school, you're taught never to start a sentence with the word "and," but it had to make complete sense. So for a long, long time, I started rakes of sentences I wrote with the word "and," because it just sounded great. It like the continuity. The first thing, he'd fall asleep beside you in the bed, giving out, and wake up 10 hours later and straight into it again, you know, as if there'd been a break for the ass. And so it was just there. The challenge from the Commitments, I suppose the fact that I had lyrics on the page, song lyrics on the page, was trying to integrate the lyrics and the dialogue. And the rhythm was vital, you know. So the dialogue that I write isn't, if you like, strictly realistic, because there's a rhythm to it, including and integrating the he said, she said, he answered, he laughed type of stuff. There has to be the rhythm. So I'll sacrifice reality to rhythm every time, you know. So it is work. Work I enjoy, and part of getting a character, I don't devote much space to physical descriptions of people.
No.
I prefer people who are reading the books to gradually come to a sense of what this character is like, and a big part of that is how he or she speaks.
That thing about rhythm, I think, is really important, because you can get an idea about somebody's character from the rhythm that they speak. But and also, I think the humour, a huge part of the humour in your books comes through the way that people talk to each other, the jokes that they tell each other, the ribbing that goes on from character to character. And that seems to me to be a very Irish thing, and possibly a Dublin thing too.
It is an art form, really. We call it slagging, you know, in the male world particularly. It's slagging, good-natured mocking, should be good-natured. There are rules. You know, somebody wears a new shirt that perhaps, you know, is a bit beyond his age or something, or, you know, or makes a break for the border in terms of buying a pair of shoes that aren't brown or black. You know, we'll get an almighty slagging about it. So it is good nature. It is, you know, in terms of Victor, the character in the book, he had this when he was a young kid and then as a young man, then left it, literally left it, went to another side of the city, and he, at one point he says he's been in the house he used to live in with his wife, he had been in all the local pubs once.
Right.
You know, so he doesn't have a local.
Yeah.
But the great thing about the local is going in and, you know, knowing the people you're with and sharing the vocabulary with them. And if it's a man's world, being able to use words that perhaps you're not allowed to use in another context, you know, and where irony is appreciated because you know who you're talking to, whereas you could use words that perhaps aren't something you'd want other people to hear, but it's known that you're not being literal when you use them, if that makes sense. And where you can be a biological being, for example, and say that she's gorgeous, isn't she? You know, as somebody walks by. And so it is the scope for humour there. But if you're excluded, I mean, Hopper's painting, you know, these solitary figures, you know, that's why they're so powerful. Yeah. Because you either, I think, leaving aside the skill and the beauty of them, you're either in the picture, you know, yourself. Yeah. And I think we all have been. Or you're worried that you would be or could be in the picture. Yeah. And we all have those moments. And when I was starting, I'd started writing the novel, and I heard a homeless man on the radio. This is going back, it must be about 4 years. And he had the crackle of middle age in his voice, and also a rough life. But he was brilliantly articulate. He was fantastic, really. And he said, I don't have it verbatim, but he said, I watch people going past me, and they always seem to know where they're going, but they never tell me the secret. And I thought that was brilliant, because it really did capture the state of homelessness, I thought, leaving aside the physical discomfort and other things. But also, it's a sensation or a feeling or that we all would feel on occasion, if not most of the time, feeling excluded. So I said to myself, I didn't rush for a notebook to write it down, but I said to myself, a character is going to say that or something very similar to that at the end of the book. So in a way I had my light at the end of the tunnel. I didn't know who was going to say it and exactly why, because it wasn't going to be a book about homelessness either, but at least I knew that somehow or other, if it wasn't the light at the end of the tunnel, it was a little signpost saying, light at the end of the tunnel.
This way. You've written in many mediums. You've written novels, you've written films, you've written plays. I just wondered whether through your career, whether your sort of preference for writing in any particular medium had changed, if there was one that you did prefer, or whether you just simply feel
I'm a novelist, I think. Now, there's been a spell where I've accepted the adventure, if you like, of writing other things. Before I started this one, when I was wondering if I did have another novel in me, got a very short email, would you be interested in writing a book with Roy Keane? The timing was perfect. If I'd been deep into the novel, I'd have said, thanks very much, very flattered, but no. But I said yes. I hesitated for a good long 10 seconds and then wrote back and said, yes, I would be interested. So in a way, it was hard work. I mean, we had to write that book in 7 months or so, maybe less. So it was hard work, 7 days a week, long hours, but it was an adventure.
Yeah.
You know, and if it had been, would you be interested in writing a book about, and you could list off endless amounts of footballers, and I just said, no, sorry, not there. But Roy Keane,
Yeah.
you know, he goes so far beyond football. And so, in a way, as far as being a novelist concerned, I took a big chunk of time off.
Yeah.
Then I was also invited to translate Don Giovanni's Mozart's opera Don Giovanni.
Yeah.
And the timing again was good, and I said, yeah, loved it, and spent a year doing that. So between one thing and the other, I've spent a lot of time in the last years writing plays that I hadn't any intention of doing until I was invited to do it, writing the Roy book, translating the opera. And I reached the conclusion after these adventures, if you like, that I want to go back to being a novelist who now and again does something else. So the novel, I mean, the evidence was there. I was doing a major cull of the books in my home, and you know, novel, short stories, novel, history, novel. You know, it's either fiction or history, really, most of it, a bit of psychology and stuff like that. But, so my bookshelf was telling me to get back to work, really.
You have this thing where you often return to characters, as I said, within families, and indeed when you wrote a series for TV called The Family, and and I wondered whether do those characters sort of live with you, and is it the characters that you feel sometimes calling back to you, sort of saying, tell this part of our story, or tell this part?
I remember hearing somebody saying, I do love my characters as if they were real people. And I've never actually, until, in a way, I've seen them adapted for the stage and for screen and the rest, and then in a way they become real, in a way. Certainly the actors.
Yeah.
I've been very lucky because they've always been well cast. But I never see them as real people. So in a way I'm in complete control of them. But on the other hand, I remember, say, 2004, looking at how Ireland had changed since I'd written The Woman Who Walked Into Doors, and I was thinking, I'd like to write a book that somehow uses these changes, or these changes, you know, economic, etc., and cultural, can be acknowledged or used. And I thought that Paula Spencer from The Woman Who Walked Into Doors would be a good person to go to, because she wouldn't be enjoying the boom insofar as she wouldn't, you know, be benefiting from it. But I thought, well, her sisters could be somehow, and she's watching this and she's amused. And she was a house cleaner and cleaned offices as well. And one change would have been, in the first book, she was working with women of her own age and class and nationality.
Right.
10 years later, she's working with, say, African women and African men, actually, and people from Eastern Europe. And now, you know, she may be the solitary Irish person in that particular workforce.
Yeah.
So I thought, well, that's interesting. So I thought, yeah, I'll bring her back. But I'm very fond of that character, you know, really fond of that character. And so it was almost like you open the door and she's there on the step, and you think, you know, lovely to see you, come on in. But at the same time, I've complete control.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So is it possible she may come back again in the future?
I'm not closed to that idea, but it's not a plan, but I'm not closed to it. If you were to ask me about other characters, I think definitely no.
Okay.
Yeah. But, like Paddy Clark will never come back, for example. Never, ever come back. And this book, it would make far less of it if I was to bring him back. So there'd be no more Victor Ford.
No.
But others, perhaps. You add years to them, you know, the camera angle changes. So I'm close to some, but not to others. And then when I say I'm close to some, I used to use the word never much more often than I do now, you know, because as you get older, you realize it's not wise. Changing your mind is actually very often a good idea.
Yeah, leave a door open, absolutely.
Yeah.
Just before we finish, I wanted to raise Fighting Words, which is the organisation that you set up over in Ireland, which is to do with child literacy and children writing.
Yeah.
Why is that so important to you? Why did you want to do that? And what's the
Well,
real aim of it?
I suppose it's the old teacher in me, really. You know, there was an irony. In my last year of teaching, I had published 3 novels, and the one that won the Booker Prize, Paddy Clark, was on the way. I'd finished it and was going to be published at the end of the school year. And I was teaching English, and I couldn't, among the brightest kids, for example, I couldn't get them to write short stories or fiction because it wasn't on the curriculum.
Right.
So creativity wasn't allowed in the school door. It was a lot of it was rote learning. Learn, 3 interesting things to write about Hamlet. Or I think it might have been King Lear that year. There's no shortage of interesting things to say, but they'd go in with a list of things that they were to do and hope that, say, W.B. Yeats came up. And it was like going into Paddy Powers, really, and putting money on one poet coming up, and as much as it was about love of English language. So I always felt I could have stayed a bit longer if I'd been let do what I could have been doing, And I was in San Francisco some years later, a long time later actually, and a friend of mine, Dave Eggers, the writer, had set up 826 Valencia, this very similar place in the Mission District in San Francisco, and he asked me to come down and have a look at it. I just thought it was magical. The invitation for the kids. They were little kids I was looking at, which, it's easy. It's an easy sell, really, because little kids are so just adorable, whereas, a big gang of teenagers, bunch of 16-year-old boys, if they're just sitting in a row, it's like 2 Berlin walls, like grey uniform, 2 rock solid Berlin walls with hair, and but I was well used to that because I'd been a secondary school teacher. But I just thought setting up a place in Dublin, I co-founded it with a friend, Sean Love, just that we'd get kids in. The fact that they were coming to us rather than we going to the school, the fact that they were coming to us made it a bit of a day out, really.
Yeah.
And that we would make writing as inviting as possible, tell them not to worry about grammar, not to worry about punctuation. You can deal with that in the 2nd or 3rd drafts, but just start writing. And we'd give them situations that made it as doable, or seem as doable as possible. Quantity first, quality later, It seemed little bit like if you have a couple of 5-year-old kids in a football, but you don't let them start playing until they can recite the offside rule.
That's important.
They're not going to be, they're eventually going to say no, and walk away and do something else instead, whereas you just let them play with the ball and gradually introduce the offside rule later on. And so that's what we do. And it's been a joy, really. We've got 6 centres now open in Ireland, on the island in Belfast as well, which is a little added source of pride, really, that it's not just the Republic.
Yeah.
We've one in Cork, Galway, Mayo, places we hadn't anticipated. And doing things, we're doing a lot of graphic fiction, for example, which I would never have anticipated. Right? So it's all, and playwriting course with the Abbey Theatre, and schools have been so supportive, So we've had, I can't remember, but something like 60,000 children in the door in Dublin, in the 9 years or the 8 years we've been open. And it's been great. And from my point of view, I find it very invigorating, my involvement, really invigorating. Because I work at home, gets me out of the house. And it's a bit, I'm not a grandfather yet, but I think if to be a teacher is a bit like being a father. My involvement in Fighting Words, I think, is probably a bit like being a grandfather, because I have the company of these people once a week, and then they go away. And I'm always happy to see them go, and happy to see them again a week later. Whereas if I was seeing them every day, I don't think I'd have the energy necessary anymore,
No.
So,
and I suppose also, we're carrying on that analogy of being more like a grandparent, you're allowed to sort of do things with them that their parents aren't allowed to do. You can kind of let them get very, very creative very quickly, and not worry about the rules so much.
It's really, it's endlessly surprising what they end up writing about. We're deliberately in the inner city so that a lot of kids from disadvantaged backgrounds will come to us, and we make room deliberately for them. But we try to make sure that we would see creativity as a right, regardless of background. So an awful lot of kids go to private schools. I mean, they're being crammed as well, to become exam machines and rugby playing machines. And, so we quite deliberately brought an old-fashioned type of school, a group of boys from a fee-paying school, and worked with them once a week for a year. And I was half dreading it because I thought I was going to have to read 24 short stories about rugby. And actually 4 of them wrote from the point of view of women.
Interesting.
Yeah, very interesting. None of them wrote about rugby.
Yeah.
So in a way, it was a slap across the head for me. Don't underestimate us, you know. If you're going to have a chip on your shoulder, leave it outside and put it back on when you're finished, you know. So it was a revelation, a very pleasant one, you know. So invariably, it's really extraordinary what they come up with. And the things they do with the grammar. I think one of the interesting things about our English as spoken in Ireland is the Gaelic grammar bubbling under. We say things that aren't said anywhere else in the world, in the English-speaking world, because they're literal translations of Gaelic into English. A case in point, when one of my kids was in school, I got a text from him, "I'm after getting into trouble." And at one level I thought, oh God, no. On the other hand, I thought, brilliant.
Yeah.
No other child in the world would send a text that, because I'm after getting into trouble. It's a literal translate, Tom Teresh, I am after, which when the Irish peasantry gave up on Gaelic and started speaking English, that's the way they said it.
Yeah.
And we still do.
Yeah.
So this kid with dreadlocks, you know, this young lad with dreadlocks, my son, was using, you know, usage that goes back to the 19th century. And what's brilliant is what the children of Polish and African people now are doing to the English grammar, the writing, because they're also learning Irish in school. They're learning European languages. They're going home and speaking sometimes with the Polish, speaking to their parents. Quite a lot of cases of kids finishing the story in English, and then is it okay to translate it into Polish so my family can read it?
Oh, right.
And so we got these parallel texts.
Yeah.
And it's brilliant what they can do, because they're bringing the grammar and the stuff to them, you know, and their fluency, the word fluency just doesn't cover what's going on.
Yeah.
Spectacular, really.
Yeah.
And quite exciting.
Must be, well, as you say, very invigorating to see that happen.
Yeah. A bit intimidating, to be honest. I struggle with English.
They'll be catching you up before you know it. I think it's great as well. It shows that given them the opportunity, the difference that writing can make to children, and that being able to be creative. I suppose in many ways Smile is a novel about the different paths that lives can take depending on what happens and what choices you make and stuff. So how nice for you to have some element of control over it, not just in your fiction, but with other children as well. So Roddy, it's been fantastic to speak to you.
Thank you.
Thank you so
much.
Thanks
very much.